over the windows, he framed a series of Toulouse-Lautrec posters with black silk mats. For a middle-aged drug bureaucrat, each item invokes sex and glamour. George White wasn't building a normal bedroom, he was building a trap. What White did next was pretty much bug the place up. He hired a Berkeley student to install bugging equipment and a two-way mirror, and he sat behind the mirror, martini in hand, and waited for the action to begin. Prostitutes would lure unsuspecting Johns to the bedroom, where the men would be dosed with LSD and their actions observed by White from beyond the mirror. As payment for their services, the sex workers would receive small amounts of cash as well as a guarantee from White that he'd intercede when the women inevitably had run-ins with law enforcement in the future. And this was just all on random Americans, pretty much just whoever would happen to be picked up by the stripper at the time, and they would be brought back to this apartment and just kind of experimented on it in these really kind of insane and, I would argue, some pretty cruel ways, and just observed for all these just points in various vulnerabilities by this really creepy guy, George White, from behind a two-way mirror, and they just kind of be sent on their way, and just whatever happens, happens with that. The CIA actually piloted these safe houses as a stage for the testing efforts in testing the effects of LSD. White's interest also shifted to another element of his observations, which was the sex. San Francisco's really kind of became the nexus for the introduction of LSD into society as a whole, and this house was the center of what one writer called the CIA carnal operations. As officials began asking new questions about how to work with prostitutes, how they could be trained, and how they could handle state secrets, the agency also analyzed when in the course of a sexual encounter information could be best extracted from the source, eventually concluding that it was immediately after sex. So they tried this on, of course, targets at one point or another, but all these points were just various innocent and kind of just unwitting people being dragged into this insane scheme. But perhaps really unsurprisingly, a lot of White's actions were driven by pure voyeurism. And really, that voyeurism was driven, I think we must acknowledge, by the American taxpayer. As he puts it, I told wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? And that was what he had. And that is what... I mean, if you haven't learned, based on the stories that we've been talking about in this series, in this podcast, it is very, very clear that a lot of American intelligence just does a lot of whatever they want, and, as you're about to see, pretty much gets away with it. The CIA's experiments with LSD persisted until 1963, before coming to a fairly anticlimactic end. In the spring of 1963, John Vance, a member of the CIA Inspector General staff, learned about the project's surreptitious administration to unwitting, non-voluntary human subjects. So pretty much, they're putting it secretly into random people. In other words, that would pretty much have to stop. Though MKUltra's directors tried to convince the CIA's independent audit board the research should continue, the Inspector General insisted the agency follow new research ethics guidelines and bring all the programs on non-consenting volunteers to an end. In 1977, Senator Edward Kennedy oversaw congressional hearings investigating the effects of MKUltra. Congress brought in a roster of ex-CIA employees for questioning, interrogating them about who oversaw these programs, how the participants were identified, and if any of these programs have been continued at any point. Hearings turned over a number of disturbing details, particularly about a 1953 suicide of Frank Olson, pretty crazy, an Army scientist who jumped out of a hotel window several days after unwittingly consuming a drink spiked with LSD, amid growing criminalization of drug users, and just a few years after President Nixon declared drug abuse as public enemy number one. The ironies of the U.S.'s troubling experimentation. And by the way, there are a lot of more stories like Operation Midnight Climax that I'm sure we can get into and you can look up at any point if you so choose and if you're interested in hearing about this. But throughout the hearings, Congress kept hitting some roadblocks. CIA staffers claimed they couldn't remember details about many of the human experimentation products, or couldn't even remember the number of people involved. The obvious next step would be to consult the records, but that presented a small problem as well. In 1973, amid mounting inquiries, the director of MKUltra told workers it would be a good idea if the MKUltra files were destroyed. Citing vague concerns about privacy and the embarrassment of participants, the men who crafted MKUltras effectively eradicated the paper record from one of the United States' most obviously illegal undertakings. A program born in secrecy would hold on to many of its secrets forever, with none of the illegalities ever really being challenged, justified, or accounted for. A common theme, I think, if you look at some of the history that we see with really all things CIA, intelligence, and a lot of the post-Cold War era, and Cold War era in and of itself, in American history, a real common and ever-present theme. That's today's episode of Uprising, a little bit on the shorter side, but hope it packed a powerful punch for you. We'll be back next week with more Hidden History.